Panasonic, the heart of your system.
Hello, Briony here from Kit Guru, and in this review I'm taking a look at Cooler Master's new flagship keyboard, the MK850. It comes in at a pretty hefty price tag of £199 because it features their new Gamepad technology. I first saw Gamepad on show at Computex and it really got me excited because I think it's probably like the next evolution in gaming keyboards. What it allows you to do is actually each key that has the Gamepad technology is pressure sensitive, so they sort of work like the joystick on a controller. You've got the same amount of movement control in game. What I didn't realise at Computex is that a company called Whopping already have an analog keyboard on the market, and I have since then tried that one out, and I am going to do my best in this review to sort of compare the two switches and let you know the pros and cons of each. But before I go into more detail, I'll start off with the basics of this keyboard. So it is a full-size mechanical keyboard. Whopping, when they brought out their keyboard, it is a 10 keyless keyboard. I think they are bringing out a full-size keyboard at some point, but Cooler Master have gone straight in with the full-size mechanical keyboard. So it does have quite a big footprint, especially when you take into account the removable wrist rest. The wrist rest attaches on using some rather strong magnets, and I actually do really like this wrist rest because it feels very sturdy, very well built, and it's also very comfortable as well, and it's pretty attractive to look at. You've got the Cooler Master logo that's sort of embossed onto this really nice sort of soft matte sort of faux leather material that is also a little bit squishy as well, so it is a really nice wrist rest to use. This keyboard has a brushed aluminium faceplate, which I must admit I do really like. It creates more of like a premium aesthetic, and there's a great contrast between it and the black keycaps. You also get another set of keycaps as well for the Gamepad area of the keyboard, and I must admit I love these because they are bright purple. As you can tell, I've got a little bit of a purple theme going on, and I think they sort of obviously match Cooler Master's sort of black and purple coloration as well, but they do really stand out, and I must admit that I love them. The sleek chassis on this keyboard, it looks really good on my desk. It is quite low profile, it's quite thin because the keys are raised off the body of the keyboard themselves, and it has this sort of like hexagonal corners that are sort of shaved off as well, which is obviously quite reminiscent of the Cooler Master logo. However, I must admit the body didn't feel quite as sturdy and solid as I was expecting it to do. It's probably because there is quite a lot of plastic going on the back of the keyboard, so it's not quite as of a chunky thing as some of the other keyboards that I've tried at this price point. However, I don't think there is any problems with build quality. When you're typing on it, it feels nice and solid. When you're pressing the keys down and things, there's not too much flex to the body, and it does of course still maintain that premium aesthetic. So if we take a look across the top of this keyboard, you'll see that it's got two little scroll wheels, so that's one more than you normally get on a keyboard, and by default Cooler Master have set the left one to change the keyboard backlighting brightness, and the right one works as a volume scroll wheel. Next to that you've got your dedicated media keys, but I must admit I was pretty disappointed that these don't light up RGB like the rest of the keyboard, and it's not just for aesthetics either because they are slightly more difficult to sort of find in the dark. You've also got a button that turns on and off the RGB backlighting, and then next to that you've got two USB 3 ports, so those do come in really handy for plugging in a USB drive or plugging in other peripherals and things. I was surprised to find as well that even though this keyboard has a USB pass-through, it has only the one USB connector, so that's really beneficial for not clogging up all the USB ports on your back of your PC and running out, because that always happens to me. And also, even better, the cable is braided, the cable is removable, and it uses a USB-C connector. Welcome to 2019. I think Cooler Master are obviously taking the hint and know that we don't want micro USB. USB-C is definitely going to be the way forward. I'm really thankful they opted to use it on this keyboard. If we flip this keyboard over, we can take a look at what's going on around the back, and as you can see you can get pretty creative with the cable routing options. I've got mine routed down the middle, but you can also route it up either side if you wanted to sort of keep your desk tidy depending on what sort of cable management you're going for. And you've also got two little plastic flip out feet as well. They are a really good size, and they've got a good size rubber pad on the bottom that prevents the keyboard slipping around, and they don't seem to flip down either as well. They do seem nice and sturdy, so they're not going to jolt your keyboard around while you're in game. Of course, any respectable keyboard wouldn't be complete without fully customizable RGB lighting, and the MK850 has just that. It comes through at a decent brightness, and you also have an extra RGB strip sort of along the bottom of the keyboard as well when you're not using the wrist rest. There's plenty of lighting modes and effects to choose between, and even the caps lock and the num lock get in on the action. You'll notice this keyboard doesn't have the little LEDs in the top right hand corner like you normally get, and that's because they sort of work like a laptop keyboard, so when you toggle them on and off, the RGB lighting also turns on and off. You can change all the settings on this keyboard using the Cooler Master Portal software, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, or the FN key on the fly system, which works on board the keyboard itself. I think this keyboard has more onboard functionality than I've ever seen in a keyboard before. Normally a lot of manufacturers seem to rely more on their software, but with Cooler Master you can do pretty much everything just using the FN key, so that's great for those of you that really hate downloading software. I don't really want this review to sort of turn into like a long-winded tutorial, so I won't go into it too much, as the way it works is quite complex and you do definitely have to spend some time with the manual to learn it and things, but I think this image basically gives you an idea of everything that it can do. You can switch and reset your profiles, you can change all the different sort of settings that you have for the Gamepad profile, you can record and create your own macros, and you also can change a lot of the RGB lighting just using the FN key. You don't just have a few profiles to sort of scroll between, you can like individually control all of the different keys and things as well. There is definitely a lot you can do. What does slightly bug me though is that the keyboard and the software do seem to work very independently from one another. If you make any changes on the keyboard itself, they don't seem to show up in the software. So recording a macro doesn't show up in the software. If you change the RGB lighting, it doesn't show up in the software. Switching between different profiles, switching between different Gamepad profiles, and even tweaking the Gamepad sensitivity all doesn't seem to really do anything. I'd much rather prefer if the software and the keyboard sort of work together in harmony rather than being more independent entities. The mechanical switches used on this keyboard are the Cherry MX red switches, so they are definitely one of my favourites for gaming with, so I think they make the most sense on this keyboard, and they are a linear switch as well, so I definitely think that's quite important for using it with the Gamepad technology, as a tactile switch probably wouldn't really work very well. The keys are actually raised off the body of the keyboard themselves, and I didn't notice any extra wobble or anything while I was typing with them, and the spacing and layout is also pretty standard. The font is nice and clear and easy to read. You haven't got any sort of like crazy gamery font that looks really kind of stupid and childish. And if I actually pull off one of the keycaps, we can see that the keycaps themselves are a little bit on the basic side. They're sort of thin, very standard keycaps that you get on pretty much any keyboard. I think it would have been nice, considering the high price point, if Cooler Master had opted to use PBT keycaps on this keyboard. So I'm now going to move on to talking about what makes this keyboard more unique, and that is definitely the Gamepad technology. I'm sorry because this is where the review starts to get a little bit long-winded, but I have done a lot of research and a lot of testing on this keyboard, and therefore there is quite a lot for me to talk about. So what is Gamepad? Each of the keys that feature the Gamepad technology has an infrared LED, and then the infrared LED detects the amount of light that is reflected from the key depending on how far down the key is pressed. So the higher up the key is, the less infrared light is reflected. The harder the key is pressed, the more infrared light is reflected. A clever bit of coding later, and the amount of pressure you push down on that switch using your finger tells the game how fast you want to go, as if you're using the joystick on a controller or the triggers on a controller. It's obviously a big advantage over the typical all or nothing approach you get from a mechanical switch, which simply has like an on or off option. On the MK850 as well, the entire keyboard doesn't use the Gamepad technology. It is only just 8 keys, but they are the 8 keys that make the most sense. So it's W, A, S, and D, and Q, E, R, and F. So what is the aimpad technology actually sort of like to set up and sort of get going with it? So the way Cooler Master have done it is pretty easy to understand really. So you've got 5 profiles that run down the left hand side of the keyboard that you can switch between, and they're pre-programmed with different settings. To turn the aimpad technology on for the first time, you press the little button that's in the top right hand side that sort of resets the keyboard and gets the aimpad turned on so that you can use it. The M1 profile works as like a default keyboard mode, so the aimpads turned on but it's sort of running in the background ready to be hot switched in, but you're not currently using it. The M2 profile is set up for like your standard FPS games, so the W, A, S and D keys are activated and they work like the left analog stick on a controller. You've got the M3 profile that is set up to work with driving and flying games, so the W, A, S and D keys are activated, W and S work as like an accelerator and a throttle, so the left and right triggers, and then A and D work as the left analog stick to sort of move your character about. And then you've got the M4 profile that is set up to work with advanced flying games. So you have got the left analog stick bound, and then you've also got the triggers bound as well on that one. And then you've got the M5 profile, which is sort of slightly different from the others, and that it's set up, all of the keys are activated, but they are bound to keyboard keys, and it just makes all of the keys super hypersensitive. So rather having the sort of like normal actuation you get on a keyboard, it makes that actuation distance really shallow, so all you have to do is like barely breathe on the key and it sort of triggers the action in game. So that's really great for games like MOBAs where you need like as fast reactions as possible. So the way Cooler Master have set this keyboard up I think is really great because it makes it really plug and play. You plug it in, you select which profile you want, and then away you go, and it just sort of works. It'll work with any game that has controller compatibility, and that is because basically the game sees the keyboard as an Xbox controller. So when you press any of those keys that are bound to controller buttons, the game thinks, oh, you're using an Xbox controller. When you go back and use the other keys, it detects that you're using a keyboard, and it just sort of works, and there's no real mucking about required. The aimpad technology is of course also fully customizable if that floats your boat and you want to play around with the little settings a bit more. So on the top right hand side of the keyboard next to where you turn the aimpad on and off, you've got options to turn the sensitivity of that aimpad up and down. What I don't like about these is there's no real indication as to what setting you're on. They don't seem to show up in the software when you turn the sensitivity up and down, so it is very trial and error and you can completely mess it up. I found out the hard way because at one point I like made the sensitivity too low, and then my key press, I was like mashing the key all the way down and it didn't really do anything, and then I made them too sensitive and I was like barely touching the key and it was registering in game, even though I wasn't even pressing the keys. It was like false key presses and everything. I did sort of completely mess up the keyboard. Fortunately, it does have an inbuilt calibration mode, which is really easy to do, and it works really well to completely reset the keyboard and get the aimpad working properly again. What I really wish though is that when you press those sort of sensitivity keys, they did change the sensitivity options in the software. I think it would be really nice to actually have sort of a visual representation of what sort of sensitivity setting you're on. And to be honest, I found that the buttons on the keyboard didn't make much sense, so I actually left them alone completely and just changed the sensitivity in the software, because I found turning the sensitivity up in the software to 8 made the keyboard more sensitive, which to me makes sense, whereas pressing the plus button on the sensitivity on the keyboard seemed to have the same effect as turning the sensitivity down in the software, so it's almost like it was backwards. I found it really hard to get my head around, so I just left the buttons on the keyboard alone and just changed all the settings in the software. When it comes to the sensitivity, the default option comes in at 1, so when you plug in the keyboard it is already set to the sensitivity of 1, which is like the lowest setting. I personally found 3 to work best for me, as it made the keyboard feel more responsive, but it wasn't too like overly sensitive either. With the sensitivity options, I do wish there was a little bit more customization as well. You can of course change the slider, but what I found is it actually changes the sensitivity for all of the profiles. They aren't controlled individually, and I also wish you could change the sensitivity for each individual key as well. So for example, I could have the throttle sensitivity to be less sensitive, but have the steering sensitivity to be more sensitive, which would make quite a lot of sense I think for some games, but all of the keys and all of the profiles seem to work just off the one slider. Using the Cooler Master Portal software, you can also edit the aimpad profiles. You can edit 3 out of the 4 different aimpad profiles. The M5 profile you can't really change, that one's just sort of left as it is. M2, M3 and M4 you can rebind all of the different buttons, and of course you have the different profiles on the keyboard as well. So you can have 4 different keyboard profiles, each with 3 different aimpad profiles, so you can actually have up to 12 different settings. So what is the aimpad technology on this keyboard actually like to use? So it does definitely take a lot of getting used to. We're all used to doing that thing where you tap to turn slowly in games, and it's something that I'm so used to doing that you really have to consciously think about not to do it. If you go and play a game now, you'll definitely know what I mean, because I didn't realise I was doing it until I got this keyboard and I was like, wow, that's definitely not going to work. So you do have to sort of consciously change your habits, but once you get used to it, it does definitely become more natural and you do definitely have more control, and it is very noticeable in games. So I tried out Forza, which is obviously a driving game. Yes, I played a driving game with a keyboard and it actually worked, because you can control the speed of the car really well and you can change the steering between slowly turning and hard turning, and it does work. It's very, very smooth. I also tried out Csgo. So Csgo, normally you have the option to sprint when you press the W key, or you have the option to sort of walk when you hold shift, or you can crouch as well. With this keyboard though, there seems that there is actually a load of different speeds that I never realised were there before, so it makes the gameplay definitely a little bit different, because you can walk at different paces that you wouldn't be able to normally without using a controller. And then you've also got, you can like peek around corners and stuff a bit differently. It does definitely change the gameplay, but you do have to consciously think about it. You've also got the M5 profile that I tried out with League of Legends, so that made the keys really, really quick to press. I mean, my reaction speed is rubbish anyway, so it probably didn't make that much of a difference. But as soon as you go to press that key, you've got skill shots firing off, basically. You haven't got to press the key all the way down in order for them to register. And then the other game that I tried with this keyboard, which I thought, wow, this keyboard would be great to play with, is GTA 5. I actually re-downloaded it because I haven't played it in ages. And it was actually really good. Once I got used to switching between the different M profiles, so jumping into a car you need to switch to M3, and then jumping out of the car and going back to walking, remember to switch back to M2, because otherwise you're just sat there punching the air like, why am I not walking forwards? Until you sort of realised. But once I got the hang of that, it was actually really good, because you have the advantage of being able to shoot with a mouse, because that's a huge advantage over a controller. Whereas also like driving is much easier with the controller, but you can still get the same sort of driving experience as you can with a keyboard. So that was really, really cool. Unfortunately, when it came to jumping in a plane, I actually found there was a bit of an issue with this keyboard, because on GTA, when you're flying a plane, not only do you need the right triggers, you also need the left and right bumpers as well. And for some reason, Cooler Master have omitted the option to bind the left and right bumpers in the software. You've only got the option for the left and right triggers, and GTA you can't change the binding options on a controller either, so that was definitely disappointing to me. It is a very specific use case, but I can imagine there would probably be issues with other games as well that do require the left and right bumpers to be bound. And yeah, I really hope that Cooler Master sort of update the software so that that's no longer an issue and you've got more key binding options. So despite those obvious pros that I talked about with the aimpad technology, like, it is a really cool tech. It does definitely make a difference if you sort of consciously think about it. It does actually feel pretty unnatural. Like, when you're using a controller and the triggers and the joystick and things, it is a very natural movement for some reason. I don't know whether it's just because we're programmed like that, but pushing down on a key does definitely feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit weird, and you do really have to consciously think about it. So when I was sort of in the heat of battle, like in CSGO, I just went back to tapping. It's very hard to concentrate on sort of pressure sensitive. I guess I probably have to like reprogram my brain so I sort of get out of the habit of doing it. And the more I have used this keyboard, the more natural and sort of better I feel like I've become with it. But it is a case of like, does it really make that much of a difference? Because when you're like in CSGO, like you're in the heat of the moment, I'm like tapping my keys, I'm trying to shoot someone's head off, I'm not consciously feeling like I need the aimpad technology at that point, and I'm not feeling like it would make that much of a difference. So I mentioned at the start of the review that I'd come across the analog technology recently in the Whopping 1 keyboard, and I took a look at this one not too long ago. I think it was probably 4 or 5 months ago, something like that. The video is out there somewhere. But basically, Cooler Master did recognise the competition in the Wooting one because it already has the analog technology, and they did try and make some comparisons, and I did want to basically see if these comparisons were true. So the Wooting one uses the FlareTech switches, which have the same analog technology, and Cooler Master have said that their aimpad switches have a sort of longer travel distance, so the entire key press can be registered, whereas on the Wooting it does have a little bit of a dead zone at the top. And I did find this to be true. It is definitely noticeable. When you press the Wooting key, you do have to press it a little bit further before it initially registers, whereas on the MK850, when you have it set up to its like more sensitive settings, you can literally barely press the key and a key press registers. There's no noticeable dead zone. Cooler Master also claimed that the key presses are more sort of smooth and consistent on the aimpad technology as opposed to on the Wooting. I must admit, this is much harder to notice, but I think it is true on some level. When I'm sort of playing in game, I didn't really notice it because you're smashing the keys quite fast, you're not really noticing that much. But if you like really focus on it and it's something you're actually checking, then I would say that the MK850 does definitely feel more smooth than the keys on the Wooting. Also, Cooler Master claimed that because the Wooting keyboard has clear stems, they can actually get sort of like interference from other sources of IR light. So if you put it under a like direct lighting from a lamp or from sunlight or something, you will get some like weird stuff happening. I did try and replicate this. I took off the keycaps and I did try and use the Wooting in like different areas, but to be honest, I didn't have any sort of weird effects happening in game. So I'm not sure if that one's true or whether it just probably happens very rarely, but if you want to be safe, then I guess the MK850 is better because it doesn't have the clear stems. However, it's not all lost because the Wooting does actually excel in certain areas. So for one, it is much more affordable than the MK850. You do save quite a bit of money. The analog technology is available across the entire keyboard. The MK850, you are limited to those 8 keys, whereas the Wooting, you have the entire keyboard you can program. And also the software on the Wooting is far superior than the software on the Cooler Master MK850. You have way more customization options when it comes to the actual analog technology. You can simply program things on the Wooting that you can't do on the MK850, such as like double actuation on the same key and things. So now I'm going to take a look at the Cooler Master Portal software. It's very easy to download and install. You get it from the Cooler Master website, and I'm also told that it should prompt you of any firmware updates as well, which I think definitely comes in handy as you don't have to go sort of hunting around for them. So on the aimpad profile, you've got the options to obviously change all your aimpad settings. So you can sort of rebind any of the keys to any of the locations on your controller. But like I said, it is definitely missing a few. You don't have any of the bumper buttons. You don't have any of the ABXY. I know they're not pressure sensitive, but it'd be quite a nice option to bind them. And then you've also got the sensitivity slider, and then you can also switch between the different profiles as well. So you can rebind them all individually. And then over here, you've got options to import and export profiles, which I think is quite a neat little feature, as you can obviously share between friends or share between other people that might have this keyboard. If we take a look at the lighting tab, you can see that you've got plenty of different options to choose between, but I did find it to be slightly more clunky and less intuitive than some software I've used. You can of course layer them up as well or completely turn it off, but you do have plenty of different options. It just takes a little bit of fiddling around to sort of get used to it. And then you've also got the key mapping tab, so you can rebind pretty much any of the keys on the keyboard to any of the other keys on the keyboard, or you can also bind your macros as well. But what I don't like is that you have the 5 profile keys on the left hand side. You can't rebind them. I guess it does make sense as they are sort of the aimpad profile keys, but it would be quite nice if you wanted to have a profile on the keyboard that doesn't have the aimpad turned on, and those just sort of bound to as extra macro keys instead. You've also got the sort of macro tab, so I have quickly sort of got one open here that I've just randomly typed in just so I can show you. So you have the options to create a macro, but you can't create any advanced macros. So some software manufacturers They allow you to sort of open programs and things, or even record mouse movement, but you can't actually do that with this keyboard. You press record and you can type in some stuff, and you can use the mouse buttons, but you can't record any mouse movement or anything. You press stop, it's recorded, and then you can quickly assign it to a key. But like I also said, if you do record your macro onboard the keyboard, it doesn't actually show up in the software. You then got the profile tab, so you can sort of reset the profile, rename it, or also import and export different profiles also. So in general, the software is pretty good. It's nice and easy to use in most cases. It's very easy to download. It's quite attractive to look at and things, but I do wish it had more functionality and options. This is a very high-end keyboard, so people that are buying it will want to make the most of that gamepad technology. And to be honest, the gamepad sort of tab is very, very basic compared to what it could be, and this because I'm comparing it to something like the whopping that literally lets you do everything, whereas Cooler Master I think could maybe find some middle ground. At the moment it is very basic and easy to use, but maybe they could add in some more advanced options so people have the option if they want it. So overall, what do I think of the MK850 keyboard from Cooler Master? It is a very well built, attractive keyboard. I think the gamepad technology is really, really cool. It does definitely take some getting used to, and I don't think that I could sort of expect it to be amazing from the start. I think you do really have to learn it and spend some time with this keyboard, and I think it could definitely be the future. I can imagine more manufacturers are probably going to follow suit with this. However, even though this keyboard has the hardware capability to be absolutely amazing, I think the software does definitely let it down slightly. I really wish it had more functionality and more settings and things, and because this is a £200 keyboard, which is a lot of money, I think it really has to be perfect to be worth that £200 price tag. But hopefully, just because it is software, Cooler Master will make some updates in the future, and the software will sort of catch up with the really good hardware on this keyboard. If you like this video from Kit Guru, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you haven't been to our channel before, welcome. Please hit that subscribe button, it really, really helps us out, and also remember to press that little bell icon as well, and you'll get a notification every time a new video goes live.